So carbohydrates fundamentally are so critical because they're tied into energy transformation. Now that becomes incredibly important in the body because there are two dramatically glucose dependent cells.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited on Sweet Liberation today to have one of our favorite people on the planet, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Welcome to Sweet Liberation, Dr. Frank.
Thank you so much for having me. It's exciting.
It's so exciting, all the way from the USA, from sunny Florida.
just about a mile from the beach, yes.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Exactly the same as rainy UK right now. We are very, very jealous, but we are so happy to have you on the show as our special guest to talk about our favorite subject, which is of course sugar, but also to open the doors to your knowledge about what's the insights about our nutrition, what's happening in the world, the problems that we are facing with our health crisis across the world, across the globe at the moment, and how sugar plays into that. So with that said, Dr. Frank, we know that you are such a fountain of knowledge. So welcome.
I think it's important when we start to get into the first idea that sugar in the body is really a double-edged sword. And I think people need to understand that before we jump into the nutritional part. We know that plants are the only thing on planet Earth that can capture the energy of the sun, and through the process of photosynthesis, produce glucose, produce sugar that feeds everything on the planet. So really on planet Earth, you have two choices. You either eat sugar, you either eat plants directly, or you eat the body of some animal that ate plants directly, because one way or another, you need to consume the carbohydrates that plants produce. Now that's an interesting piece, because that glucose, when you put it into the body, in the human body, in the presence of the oxygen that we're breathing, it will go into little energy factories in the cells called mitochondria, where it's transformed into all the packets of energy that we need to do everything that we do. So carbohydrates fundamentally are so critical because they're tied into energy transformation. Now that becomes incredibly important in the body because there are two dramatically glucose dependent cells. One are brain cells. You know, the brain is only 2% of our body weight, but requires 20% of our energy. So if you think about that, that's a really important energy dynamic. And the other cell that's glucose dependent are red blood cells. That's why when people do a blood test, they can do a measurement called hemoglobin A1C. And all that measures is the long-term regulation of sugar in our blood. So for example, if I put a needle in your arm and take a blood sample and I measure glucose or sugar, I'm only measuring it in that moment. So that's not really giving me a good picture of what's happening over time. But if I look at the blood cell and look at hemoglobin itself, I get a picture of sugar across time. That's why many doctors will do both the blood test, the initial glucose measurement, but then they'll look at hemoglobin A1C. It's the best way to evaluate diabetes, pre-diabetes, things of that nature. So glucose is unbelievably important for energy transformation. However, it's a double-edged sword, because when sugar levels go up in the body, it becomes one of the most toxic, dangerous chemicals in the human body, because it will eat its way through the human body. That's why if you look at people with diabetes or high blood sugar, what happens? They lose their eyes, they lose their limbs, they lose their kidneys, they lose their hearts. So the body is always stuck with the dilemma. How am I going to keep that blood sugar within a very well-defined range of normal, so I can, when it gets elevated? And this becomes a real issue when you look at our culture, where there's so much of a concern on sugar products. And I know you guys, of course, with your product are making a dent. You're really getting into, trying to help that outcome. But the bottom line is, because of the importance of sugar, the body then wants to do everything it can to keep that sugar within a well-defined range of normal. So it has a hormone in the body called insulin, which is produced by the pancreas, which plays the role of making sure that sugar that's in the blood can now move into our cells. So insulin plays a very important role for controlling how sugar is regulated in the bloodstream. Now, what people don't realize is that when you have sugar in the body, because it's so important, not only does your body want to keep a certain amount, it wants to save a certain amount, like a savings account for a future time, a time of stress, a future time of need. So the best sink, the bank, the savings bank actually happens to be our muscle cells. So the body will take extra sugar, drive it into the muscles, where it will store it like a bunch of sugars put together called glycogen. That's just a starch of all simple sugars. So when you're under stress or you have a certain demand of energy, your body now knows it can kind of lean on that savings account. So insulin has to attach to certain little proteins, receptors on the surface of muscle cells. And those boxes are kind of like little locks, but they're unique in that the shape of those locks exactly matches the shape of insulin, like the lock matches the key of a door. So when they stick that key in the door and I turn it, the door swings open. When insulin attaches to that lock on the surface of a muscle cell, it opens the door of the muscle cell and sugar can now enter. So if you think about sugar being controlled in the body, there's only 3 steps. There's the release of insulin, there's the attachment of insulin, and then there's the opening of the door for sugar to enter. And I go through all of that because when you look at the ways that we eat, what a lot of processed foods, especially high fat foods, and this is an important piece, because everybody thinks elevated blood sugar is due to increasing sugar levels alone, and it's not. What happens is when you have really processed foods, you get a tremendous absorption of fat very quickly into those muscle cells. When fat enters those muscle cells, it takes up space in the muscle cell, so there's no place for sugar to enter. And so what happens is the body will start to resist the attachment of insulin, and you'll have what we call insulin resistance. And all insulin resistance means is that we've kind of lost the sensitivity to insulin being able to control the movement of sugar into our cells. And I say that because the mistake that many people make, and even the major international diabetic associations, what do they tell people to not eat when they have high sugar? Well, don't eat any carbohydrate, which is the biggest mistake of all, because what the problem really is high fat. When the fat goes up, it blocks insulin attachment, and then what happens is sugar can't enter your cells. Well, if sugar can't enter your cells, what's going to happen to sugar in your bloodstream? It has to go up. So elevated sugar follows on the heels of insulin resistance, which actually follows on the heels of refined high fat intake. And so that's the reason why, we have people come to centers like I run. They can have diabetes. We can give them plant-based carbohydrates, fruits, vegetables, all of that. And it's all carbohydrate diet. And we'll see blood sugar levels drop 100 to 200 points in a week. And all they're eating is carbohydrate. So, so if anybody takes anything from this talk alone, take that piece home, that high fat is an issue. But here's the point. When sugar can't get into cells and insulin's not working well, it starts rising in your bloodstream. So when it starts to rise, your body begins to think it's not producing enough insulin. So what happens is it starts overproducing insulin, creating something called hyperinsulinemia, excessive insulin in the blood. The problem with that is when you start having extra insulin being produced, insulin kind of works like a growth factor. It can trigger tumor growth, for example. It can trigger heart disease, for example. So that change of provoking that pancreas to over and over and over produce insulin lays the groundwork for a whole range of major health problems. So, for example, cancer cells have a huge number of insulin receptors on them. So when you provoke insulin release by elevated sugar because insulin's not working, now you're going to trigger cancer growth. And probably your listeners and you guys have probably saw that people talk about the relationship of sugar to cancer. Well, that relationship happens because of that hyperinsulin effect that's provoking these changes, especially breast cancer in women, prostate cancer in men, things of that nature. So yes, we want to, the mentality is that you don't want to provoke elevated sugar, but if you don't fix the underlying factor of insulin attachment first, you're not really addressing the problem. And as it turns out, it's not just diet that blocks insulin action. The lack of physical activity blocks the way insulin works. Chronic stress blocks the way insulin works. Sleep deficiency blocks the way insulin works. So all of those lifestyle factors are triggering blood sugar changes and elevated sugar. So now if I come in and I start putting in a lot of sugar into that system, yeah, I'm going to provoke elevated sugar. But until I fix that underlying insulin resistance, I'm not really addressing that problem. And here's the issue. When sugar levels begin to go up, we already made the point that elevated sugar is a toxic stress to the body. So your body wants to reduce that sugar, get it out of the way of circulation. Well, guess what? When we look at fat, fat is 9 calories of energy for every gram, whereas carbohydrates are only 4. So if you're eating a lot of fat grams, you can see how you're accruing a lot of calorie intake. But not only does fat provide 9 calories per gram when you eat it, but it provides 9 calories of potential energy when you store it. So fat becomes a remarkable storage area for sugar. So think about this. So we can make the case that when you look at elevated sugar, the body's going to do everything to protect you against the toxic effects. So it will start to drive it into all of those areas, that we kind of reach out. I call these booby arms. My grandmother, when she used to wave to me from the fire escape, when she'd stop waving, her arm would still be waving like a hammock of fat underneath that arm. And so the bottom line is it stores it in all of those areas. So we can make the case that obesity, which right now is a pandemic, it's an epidemic throughout the world, is nothing more than the body's wise attempt to protect us against the toxic effects of elevated blood sugar. So if we didn't do that, if we didn't have that sugar change, if we really improved that insulin, there would be no obesity. It would be over. And right now in both of our countries, we have more than 70% of people are overweight and obese. And more than 40% are totally obese. And the largest group of fat growing people in the last 20 years have been children under the age of 19. So you start thinking about this devastation related to this. So I just wanted to lay that groundwork because I think it's important for people to realize the relationship of sugar and fat and how the body uses fat to store sugar that's excessive because sugar is so toxic. That makes sense what I just said?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Incredible. Frank, that was such a great explanation of the way our body really works with glucose. And I think that's been so informative for everybody. And I know for people that are your fans and that know about your work, we all know and love you for your expertise. But tell us a little bit about your background, what makes you so passionate about this subject? And maybe let's talk about some of the work that you're doing now.
Well, yeah, generally from my own background, I got involved early on with this mentality of something called natural hygiene, where we look at, the biological requirements of life and health. And I was very interested in being a doctor from very early in my life. But I realized early on that, typical medical practice was not going to be the way I was going to go because I was learning about more of the lifestyle approaches with nutrition and lifestyle. And so at that point in my early stages of my life, chiropractic was a better way for me to go because it was a natural approach. It did not involve drugs and surgery, and I could counsel people in lifestyle change. So I went in that direction. I got interested early on in the idea of water-only fasting as a clinical tool, and I met a huge number of practitioners who were running major fasting institutions all over the world, from the United States to England to Australia. And I started kind of getting with them, studying with them. I did an apprentice with one of them in Cleveland, Ohio. And then, after doing that, I ran a number of residential centers where we would have anywhere from 50 to 100 people a week. And I would lecture and we would take care of them. We would feed them. They would do stress management programs. They would eat plant-exclusive food. So for my own life, I've been plant-exclusive in my own dietary plan since the 1970s. And I always tell people the last meat of it or anything like that I had was in like 1971. And when I tell people that, they're kind of like, what? 50 plus years ago. But the bottom line is, once doing that, I decided I wanted to do more research. So I went back in the United States to a medical university called Emory, Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta. And I got a Ph.D. in neuroscience and neuroendocrinology. I did research. And then I went to the University of Texas that in the 1980s had the largest aging research center in the world. And I became an assistant professor in that research project. And we did all of the original research on calorie restriction and aging. And subsequent to that, and that became all of the information on intermittent fasting and all of that. It was all done through that laboratory. And so from there, I ran a huge center for 25 years. And currently, I'm still doing that kind of residential work, but only doing 1-week retreats a month at a local hotel here in Deerfield Beach, where we offer either plant food, juice fasting, or water only fasting. So there are 3 programs, and we still do that. So it's been quite a journey from the 1970s on to, you know, where I am today. So.
Oh, yeah, it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So when you're talking about the kind of pandemic that we are experiencing at the moment, I mean, in my professional career in a healthcare capacity, also seeing just such a vast change, even in the last 20 years. You must have seen so many changes in your career, and what do you think we need to do about this crisis in terms
well,
of?
look, it truly does begin with the food. There's no question about it. And the fact that we have such a dependency on animal food production and processed food production, that's where it has to change. Now, how do we change that? How do we get that into the mindset of children and kids in kindergartens and, you know, early school years, because that's where it has to really start. And unfortunately, to do that, you have to deal with the caregivers of those children, which are the parents. So unless the parents are doing it in the home, likelihood the child's not going to do it in the home. So you've got to have this kind of family input through the schools, through any way that we can do that. And there's a lot of people now trying to make those kind of moves, trying to get that education ongoing, because, you know, you're dealing with, when you deal with sugar, you know, you're dealing with something, as we mentioned earlier on, that's a primal need in the human being. It's a primal need in the brain. So what's interesting is the industries have kind of bastardized that fundamental need. I liken it to pornography in a way. If you think about it, we have a natural drive for reproduction and sexual intimacy. And pornography kind of takes that and kind of creates almost a caricature of that. Well, a lot of the foods that we have produced are pornographic foods. I mean, we need sugar fundamentally. We need the carbohydrates in plants, but we've created this bastardized version of refined and processed sugars that play on that basic biological need, but only create a disconnect in energy and function and well-being when people ascribe to that more and more. So we've created really addictions to the very pornographic process part of that. And we've diverted people away from the fundamental carbohydrates that need to be the major part of their diet: fruits, vegetables, and whole foods. So, you know, how do we change that? We change that by really making people aware, but also by educating them younger and younger and younger. And hopefully parents will start to get this information and realize that, yeah, I got to put this into the lives of my children, because what's going to happen, these children are not going to live nearly as long as the previous generation, the way things are going. And that's a sad commentary on our culture.
Absolutely.
You know, let's talk about that for a second, that addiction part, because I think that's a remarkable thing for people to see the whole story. You know, back in the 1960s and 1970s, major food conglomerates, groups like General Mills and Kraft, and, you know, the big food producing conglomerates that were producing a lot of food that people bought, they wanted to get an idea of how they could get people to buy more of their products. So they hired a group of scientists. A very famous one in the United States was a guy called Howard Moskowitz. And his job, interestingly enough, they were trying to see how they could get and make the meals that they were giving soldiers in the Vietnam War more palatable so they would eat them. And so they hired these, what were called psychophysicists, these guys that would, and women that would work on what are the chemicals that we can introduce that will make this more appealing. So they decided that the 3 major things that really truly affect appeal are salt, sugar, and fat. And so what they said is, what's going to be the combination of these three items that are going to make these foods the most appealing to the most people? And then they said, you know what, we're going to add one more thing and really take it over the top. And that last thing was crunchiness. So now they had a formula. And so people like Howard Moskowitz said, we're going to come up with just that right amount of those items that will create what they called, interestingly enough, back then, the bliss point. What's going to create the greatest amount of bliss for people eating these products? And what they did is they came up with the salt, oil, and sugar formulas that would then put into all of the canned goods, chips, crackers, tomato sauce, and everything that was sold from that point forward. What they didn't realize at that time that was going to feed a pandemic of obesity, or if they had any idea, they didn't pay much attention to it. But the bottom line is, so they have been plaguing, it's been a plague since that time, of these ultra processed foods, which have only gotten even more processed, to be a major part of the food supply of the world, especially the Western world, the UK, the US, all of that. So unless you break through that, and here's the reason why, because the brain has such a need for glucose and sugar. Sugar activates in the brain what is called the brain reward cascade. And I love that word cascade because it's like a waterfall of chemicals in the brain. They're neurotransmitters. They start with something called serotonin in the hypothalamic part of the brain. And they go through a series of transmitters that eventually leads to the expression of something called dopamine. And dopamine is the pleasure transmitter. Dopamine is how we experience pleasure with sex and meditation and laughter and community and all of that stuff, intimacy. So dopamine is a real key thing in the human brain. It's tied into so every one of us has the ability to experience pleasure from the simple acts and joys of life because we have this brain reward cascade. And if you think about it, it's kind of etched into us because of two fundamental things. One is our individual survival, and then, of course, our survival as a species. So that means what's going to do that? Well, that's going to be food. So it's really exacts this incredible amount of pleasure from food so that we will not only get food, we'll remember the pleasure of eating food, and we'll be motivated to go get it again. So when you do that, it reinforces survival individually and as a species. So there's a tremendous amount of pleasure and reward associated with food. Now, we also know, though, that there are genetic factors, there are lifestyle factors of stress, et cetera, that can actually compromise that brain reward cascade. So people will not feel pleasure from the simple acts and joys of life. And they will start to feel what is created now is called a reward deficiency syndrome. And when they have a problem with experiencing reward, now they'll have feelings of anxiety and depression and isolation. And in fact, in the field of addiction, the reward deficiency syndrome is seen as the foundation of all addiction. Because when you're feeling that way, no brain wants to feel anxious and alone and isolated. So you'll do everything you can to self-medicate your own brain reward. And that leads to the 5 major forms of addiction. Food, which we already talked about, drugs and alcohol, sex, what used to be called gambling, but is actually risk-taking. We like to take those risks, we get that rush. And then finally, what are called process addictions, like work, porn, internet, shopping. Those things all have one thing in common. They try to, if you will, stimulate brain reward because there's a reward deficiency. So one of the things that happens in the field of addiction is they have to help people establish healthy brain reward by doing a wide variety of lifestyle things. But here's the point. As different as all of those addictions can be and the choices that you may make, there's one thing common to all of those addictions, and that is sugar addiction. Sugar has an impact on the brain very much like another white powder that we call cocaine. And when sugar goes into the human brain, it will provoke a dopamine response like cocaine does. And here's the problem. Whenever you stimulate chemically something like dopamine in the brain, your brain begins to believe that you're making enough of it on your own. So it turns down your natural production because you're stimulating it with these artificial chemicals, whether it's heroin, alcohol, or sugar. So now if I immediately take sugar away, there's going to be a period of time where your body hasn't been making its own. And also the places where the sugar has to attach or to release dopamine, those receptors start to be ratcheted down because the body thinks it's making too much. So that period of time between when you start making your own neurotransmitter again and you improve where it's going to attach, that space of time is called withdrawal. That's what withdrawal is. And that applies to any drug, any chemical, including sugar. So when we immediately take sugar away from people, they go through that drug withdrawal. And so the bottom line is these industries have done this insidious thing because by incorporating the sugar, salt, and oil, they have reinforced this abnormal stimulation of the brain reward cascade, and it creates a process of addiction. And when you look at addiction, remember, there's always this process where at first you get high. Then secondly, it takes more of the same drug to get you high because there's a little tolerance that builds. And then eventually you're not getting high with the drug, you're just taking it to stop the pain of not using it. And so what happens is at that point, you're in the throes of addiction because the middle part of your brain, the very reactive part of it, is telling the conscious controlling part of your brain that without this substance, you will not survive. So sugar actually tricks the brain into telling you that you need this for survival, and you need these refined processed foods for survival. And that's why when we do our food, not only do we give people plant food, we give it to them without added salt, oil, and sugar. It's SOS free. And so that allows us to break that process of addiction and that process of change. But think about how these industries have so insidiously incorporated these things to create these artificial bliss points so they can use that to sell massive amounts of these products. And it's a devastating process. So when you ask me, how's it going to change? Well, you've got to break with those industries. You've got to break with those foods. You've got to realize that they're operating at such a deep physiological and psychological level by incorporating themselves into that brain reward cascade. That's a big piece.
Yeah. That's a huge, huge task. I think the more we uncover about sugar, the more we uncover the task, which is monumental, and the damage that's been done is just wow.
Yeah, and I'm really surprised. And interestingly, it's one of the things, and you've answered actually one of the questions that I've had in my mind for a few months, really. And that is a lot of products that I'm seeing as I'm going to the supermarket and I'm flipping onto the back and I'm saying, why are they adding sugar to these nuts? Or why are they putting the why are they putting the sugar in? I want a healthy snack and then 5% sugar. But sounds exactly like you're saying.
Welcome to the bliss point. That's it. Now, think about this. Not only are they adding sugar to nut butters and things, what else? They're adding oil to them. Now, nuts, they're loaded with oil. Why anyone feels compelled to add oil to a product that is 70% oil is bizarre. So if you think about it, it goes back to that early work in the 60s and 70s where they were looking for those formulas. How can we addict people to buying these products? How can we create such ultra-processed foods that the human brain feels that it can't live without them? And that's what's being done in the marketplace. And think about that. That starts early in our children. If you look at refined sugar, and when we look at the refined sugar that's put into all these products, that starts with infant baby foods and children's cereals. They can be 70 and 80% refined sugar. I tell this story because it's one of my favorite studies. I don't remember the citation, but it was actually the results of a study. And they said, you know what? We're going to feed rats children's breakfast cereals. And we want to see the impact of these children's breakfast cereals on the ability of these rats to learn how to run mazes. It was a learning experiment. So guess what they did? They fed one group of animals the cereal that the children would eat, and everybody knows these, Captain Poop Poop and Captain Pop Pop, you know all these cereals, right? So they fed one group of animals the cereal, and get this, they fed the other group of animals the box that it came in. They literally shredded the box. It looked like shredded wheat, and rats will eat the box the same way they'll eat the cereal. They would chew on the box. The animals that ate the box did better in every learning experiment they could measure. So I tell parents and grandparents, if you got children, you want to give them breakfast cereals, give them the box.
In the
Oh my
box. That's
God.
brilliant. That's
Oh.
similar to the story we tell at Christmas, where the children actually take a present out of the box and play with the box.
That's right. Yeah, but it's just crazy. But you think about how much we're abusing our children at an infant level. This is right out of the womb. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. It's bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre.
It's absolutely mind-boggling that what we are doing to our population with all of these. I've actually shifted my opinion. I'll pick your brains on this, but I don't even consider these things as, because they have so little, if any, nutritional value, or zero, in many cases, zero nutritional value, all the calories, and you would die if you ate that stuff every day, and you do. So I call it a sensory experience. It's just a sensory experience. It's not food. It's a sensory experience. It's crunchy and salty and sweet, and it's not feeding you.
Right. Well, remember this too. As you eat those foods, especially with salt and sugar and oil, you're actually conditioning your sense of taste to those foods. So, for example, if you get used to that ultra hyper palatable food, if I take that out, things start to feel tasteless to you. And it's not the food that's tasteless, it's actually the person that's tasteless. Because what happens is the taste buds have a certain threshold that has to be exceeded before you can taste anything. So in the mouth, we got taste buds attached to nerves, they go back to the brain. And let's suppose that set of taste buds gives you the sense of sweetness, just for the sake of argument. Well, there has to be enough sugar molecules in what you're eating for those nerves to fire, because there's a certain threshold that has to be achieved, right, for it to activate. So what happens is the more I add salt and condiments and sweeteners to that, I actually raise the threshold, so that now I need that much more stimulation before I can taste anything. So how many people do you know? My father was like this. Before he tasted anything, he'd have a salt shaker going.
A lot of people.
And he'd say, "Oh, this food is tasteless." I said, "Dad, the food's not tasteless. You are, because you can't taste anything till it exceeds that level." So what happens is when people start eating in a more healthy manner, or they juice fast, or they even water fast, one of the first things that happens is the taste sensitivity goes through the roof. I'll have people after a fast eat a piece of plain lettuce, and they'll sit there waxing philosophical for, oh, this lettuce, oh, this lettuce, oh, this lettuce. And they're tasting things that they couldn't taste before. Yeah. And so what happens is when that starts happening, you now can break that connection to this hyper palatable food, because when you eat that, you're kind of like, oh my God, what is this? It's disgusting. But you got to get to that point where you kind of retrain the entire taste sensitivity again.
Yes, we found that as well. When you stop eating the sugar, you stop wanting to eat the sugar, and it eventually, if you do go and taste something that's sweet from a shop, you're like, oh, it's too sweet.
I tell people for 30 days, when you're trying to make this change, and you want anything sweet, make fruit your sweet.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you think about it, the most colorful things in nature are fresh fruits, all their colors. And that goes into the fact that we have a color sensitivity in our eye that matches that. That's why when we see that, we know that's the most natural food for us. If you look at bonobos and various other primates, fruit and greens are such a major component of their diets, and it ties into our visual spectrum too. But I tell people, we're coming into this time of year now where it's mango time. So all the trees in Florida, in my whole neighborhood, they're just swollen with mangoes everywhere. So mangoes are starting to drop. When you take one of those sweet mangoes off a tree and you eat that, there is nothing sweeter than that. There is no reason to eat any processed refined sugar in any way, shape, or form when you're eating those plants, just none. And when you get used to eating those plants, you can't go back to eating refined sugar. It's appalling. You are really appalled by it at that point, but you got to give yourself a chance to get to that point.
Absolutely, we found that as well.
Yeah,
for sure.
And our journey over that, our sweetness, taste of sweet, our taste buds have changed, haven't they, over time?
Massively, and we also don't want to be part of an addictive food industry.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
We have said absolutely ethically, no way. This is not. We don't want to be part of that. In fact, although we have product as part of our business model, we're like, well, if you don't need the product once you've got off the sugar, we're good. Like we're not telling you go eat this all the rest of your life. Absolutely not a stepping stone. But ideally, you will have no sugar and nothing sweet. You don't need it because you have all these other foods that, as you've just mentioned. So, so tell us about your current projects, Dr. Frank. I know that
the current project, what I'm really excited about is I just finished a book, which is amazing to me because it was such a labor of love and such an intense piece of work. You know, I don't think people realize how much of an arduous introspective journey it is to write a comprehensive book. I mean, it's really like work, but it's great. It's called Weightless: Compassionate Weight Loss for Life. And there are whole chapters on what we talk about sugar and all the things we've been talking about, because one of the things I find that has been a problem with the whole weight loss story is that it's been incredibly short-sighted. The focus has been oftentimes on food and exercise alone, and it's giving the people the unconscionable idea that to lose weight effectively, they have to eat and kill animals, meaning you got to go on paleo diets, keto diet. They're all animal-based, high-protein or high-fat diets, which is one of the biggest incorrigible lies in the history of biology. So, and also we now know that when we look at the overall picture of weight loss, it's a much bigger picture because it involves not only the food that we're eating, but it involves the impact of stress. It involves the impact of sleep. It involves the impact of environmental toxins. It involves the impact of stress and hormonal balance. So this book, I cover it all. I cover the full constellation, the full picture, while reinforcing the idea that nothing has to die and no environment has to be ravaged for people to achieve their weight loss goals. That's really what the book is about.
Amazing.
And it's a piece that it's really a culmination of everything I've kind of done over the past 45 years clinically. So I'm very pleased with it.
Well, hopefully we can provide a link.
Well, it's going to be available on Amazon in about 2 to 3 weeks. I'm real happy.
Oh, brilliant!
Yes, we will. We will certainly be.
Yeah, we're in the final proof edit right now, and it's going to be uploaded in a couple of weeks. So that's going to be great.
Incredible. How exciting.
And I'll tell you what I'm really interested in, we'll maybe be able to pick up on this at another time, is that there's a lot that's coming up at the moment about people wanting to become younger and things, and anti-aging.
Well, you want to talk about it right now? Do we have time?
If you've got a few more minutes to talk about it, we would, you know, the anti-aging thing. I thought.
Yeah, I made the point to you early on when you asked about my background.
Yes.
And I said that I was involved in the research at the University of Texas that was the largest research facility in the world. Well, the short of their research was, and this was something that came out of data long before that lab, was that when they took animals and they restricted the calories that they took in, there was such an escalation of longevity. So, for example, if they took rats and gave them enough food so they could run around, play, nibble, and reproduce, and then they calculated how much that was in calorie content, and then reduced it by 40% and fed another group of animals that 40% reduction in calories. The animals on the reduced calories lived on average 50% longer. So that would be like you and I adding 40 years to our lives by just simply restricting calories. So I think you can appreciate that drove scientists wild. How could such a simple modification create and not only did they live longer, but they had a remarkable decrease in the diseases of aging. So the animals that were dying quicker were actually creating chronic diseases quicker. So when you look at what that escalated was, what are the mechanisms that are allowing that to happen? So a number of things came up about that. And it had to do with things like oxidative stress, free radical damage that occurs because of poor nutrition, exposure to alcohol, toxic stuff in the environment. So that oxidative stress was one model. And so reducing oxidative stress is one idea. Chronic inflammation was another idea. So they noticed that the animals that lived longer had less oxidative stress, they had less inflammation. And for our discussion, they had less of something called the glycation of protein. And that's where I want to take you right now, because what was discovered is that in the body, when sugar levels go up, or you're incorporating a lot of refined sugar in the system, it has the ability to actually create a reaction with existing protein in the body. It literally does what is called cross-linking of protein. I don't think people realize enough, because it's always taught in such a static manner, that if you look at proteins, they're very complicated molecules, and they're kind of like strings of beads. And the beads on the string are the individual building blocks of protein called amino acids. As it turns out, proteins are these huge strands of beads. And usually in a protein, there's not one strand, there's multiple strands that are wound together like you would braid somebody's hair, or you would make a rope by braiding the strands of a rope. So proteins to function have to be able to have those strands freely vibrate at a certain frequency, like the strings of a musical instrument. And people don't realize how electromagnetic the body actually is. So protein strands have to vibrate at the musical note that is actually defined as health within our bodies. So when those strands are vibrating, not only do they vibrate, but proteins have to fold and unfold and vibrate. And so there's this incredible dance, three-dimensional dance, that allows proteins to do everything that they do, whether that's a protein hormone or whether that's a protein enzyme for digestion. So here's what happens. When sugar levels go up, they cross-link those strands of the protein. It's like putting a capo on a guitar, puts pressure on the strings, so that now the strands of the protein can't vibrate like they're supposed to. They can't fold and unfold like they're supposed to. So it interferes with protein function to such a degree that they feel that many of the diseases of aging are due to sugar's interference with protein action and expression. Think about that. And that reaction is known to bakers as a Maillard reaction. It's how bread turns brown when you're making a crust, when you're baking bread. So the interaction of sugar and protein. So what happens is this glycation was called in the aging field advanced glycation end products, the acronym AGE, AGE. And all it was the products that were produced when high sugar levels were cross-linking protein molecules. And they discovered that many of the diseases of aging are seen as glycated outcomes. So for example, cataracts in the eyes are the glycation of the cross-linking of lens protein, so it no longer works effectively. The loss of collagen elasticity in the skin is the collagen fibers being cross-linked. There's now even a model that the plaques that are found in the brain of Alzheimer's patients and people with dementia have that cross-linking of sugar and protein. So now Alzheimer's is actually referred to in many circles now as type 3 diabetes.
Yeah.
Think about that, because of the sugar-protein interaction in the brain. So the point here is those AGEs are remarkably produced not only by elevating refined sugars, but by the way we cook and prepare our foods. So the more you heavily fry and barbecue and blacken foods, you raise the AGE content, and you're creating a premature aging outcome, which is why we recommend lightly steaming, lightly sauteing food rather than blitzing it with high heat and burning it with high frying heat, grilling, all of that. It creates AGE production. So we now know that protein sugar interaction is actually one of the most fundamental parts of the aging process and causes premature aging. And as it turns out, when you're eating a lot of plant foods, what's intriguing is that all of the models that showed up in the calorie restricted animals that make them live longer, all of the things that make them live longer are actually produced by just eating plants. Think about that. So when I do my talks on aging, I actually bring all of that scientific research back to just plant-based eating, because that's what actually reverses all of the aging phenomena that actually happen. And it changes all the enzyme and hormone functions and all of it that are involved with that. And we do know that there are certain enzymes in the body that provoke premature aging. As it turns out, once again, eating plants, lots of fruits and vegetables, actually ratchet down those aging hormones. So does things like fasting. It actually creates what's called an autophagic pathway that blocks premature aging. So the truth of the matter is we have so many people trying to change aging from the outside. They're going to do cosmetic surgeries. They got to nip and tuck and liposuction, or they've got to do these very risky things with now some of these glucagon-like peptide agonists like Ozempic and some of these drugs that are now being sold, when in fact, just eating high fiber plants does everything we know to slow down the aging process better than anything.
Amazing. So food really is medicine.
Mhm.
We all agree on that.
And again, that also plays with stress and things of that nature too, obviously. So when we talk about these pillars of lifestyle, they all kind of dovetail into, so if you're going to do this, eating plant-based, working on minimizing stress with stress management technique, getting better sleep, being more physically active, all the things that were common sense issues, we now have tremendous science to show how supportive they are, how they actually change everything, even at a genetic level, which is a whole other area called epigenetics, which we could talk about another time. But the bottom line is you could see that impact. So we need the sugar, but the work you're doing with finding these substitutions that free people, from putting these products into their bodies that so dramatically promote premature aging and heart disease and addiction. I mean, it's within their reach. Everybody has that opportunity to make those choices that can really help themselves.
Yes, thank you so much. I think it's just been every time we speak with you, Dr. Frank, you are like an encyclopedia, a wealth and a fountain of knowledge. It's such a pleasure.
It's always fun to be with you guys.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Do you have any gold nuggets you would love to leave our audience? Because I'm sure they're all glued like this to this.
My biggest nugget is a statement that Herbert Shelton made once. It was one of the granddaddies of the hygiene movement in America. And he said, you're free to make choices, but you're not free to choose the consequences. No. And the point to that, and what I tell people is, think about what your goals are. What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to be leaner, healthier, more fit? And if you are the choices you're making, are the consequences of those choices congruent with those outcomes? Are they leading to that outcome? Mm-hmm. And if they're not, you and I have to put the big boy and big girl pants on, because nobody can do that for us. There's no one that can do that for you. So I want people to understand the incredible power of personal choice. I want people to understand that even in very sophisticated advanced disease, it can be reversed. It can be prevented, and not only prevented, it can be reversed. But those choices have to start now. And so I tell people, take a good look at your life. What are you trying to achieve? And then what are the choices you're making that can get you there? And I'm here to tell you that those are all around you, and they're the simplest things. I call it the profound level of simplicity. There's simple lifestyle changes, but you got to eat whole foods. You've got to move your body more. You've got to work on, better relationships with the events of your lives, the stress that's impacting us. So all of those things are within our reach, but we have this incredible ability and power to really heal ourselves. That thing is going on within us. Healing is a process that never takes a vacation. It's like the circling of the earth around the sun, or the changes of night and day. It's a ceaseless process. And all we need to do is understand that by dealing and knowing that process occurs, what can we do to incorporate the biological requirements that give us the greatest opportunity to be well? And that's really within the reach of everyone.
Amazing. Well, incredibly empowering and inspiring words, Dr. Frank. It's been such a pleasure. And we hope that you won't be a stranger. We hope that we can have you back. Yes. And also,
I'm going to come around July. I'll be back in my second home, the UK. You know that.
So. Perhaps we can interview you from a mountain somewhere together.
That's always fun. That'll be fun.
That's so be fun. It's been such a pleasure. We send our deepest appreciation.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
To your home in Florida, and we hope to have you get back again on our Sweet Liberation podcast. Bye.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the audience that tuned in with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.